Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome. Good. I'm looking at Jenny to make sure that that you can all hear. Thank you so much to the Center for Mark Twain Studies, to Elmira College and the Park Church for having me, and particular thanks to Joe Limack and to Matt Siebold for their tireless work for the center. I'm so delighted to be here with you in Elmira in the historic Park Church to talk about John W. Jones and Mark Twain together. Elmira, as will become apparent over the course of this talk, has been absolutely critical in developing my thinking about the afterlives of the American Civil War. I first came to Elmira about a decade ago, while I was still in graduate school and fumbling around for a topic for my dissertation. And I was so struck by the geography and the topography, by the monuments, by the history, that the city and the space became emblematic of the war's geographical dissonances for me. And I've really been returning to it over and over again in thought ever since. So to be here with you in Elmira after a year when travel and community, when togetherness was taken from so many of us, is incredibly special to me. And it's particularly special to see so many of you whom I've met from across the ocean. Susan and Rachel, I think I saw Talima somewhere. Hi, Talima. And Matt and Joe, and so this is just a thrill for me. But I'd like to begin this talk not in the southern tier, but in the nation's capital. So in 2020, as we all know, anti-racist protests in response to the murder by police of George Floyd spread from the United States across the globe. And the movement to remove and replace Confederate monuments in the American South gained renewed interest. As scholars extended the conversation beyond blatant shrines to the Confederacy, to monuments that ostensibly supported the Union but did not meet modern standards of representation, the focus shined briefly on Washington, D.C.'s Emancipation Memorial, also called the Freedmen's Memorial, which you can see here. The memorial, which was paid for by free blacks to honor the fallen Abraham Lincoln, showed the martyred president standing over a crouching and nearly naked enslaved man. At the statue's 1876 unveiling, and in the presence of friend of Twain, Ulysses S. Grant, Frederick Douglass acknowledged the historical and discursive function of Black memorial spaces, beginning his speech with the recognition that, quote, "Wise and thoughtful men of our race who shall come after us and study the lesson of our history in the United States, who shall survey the long and dreary spaces over which we have traveled, who shall count the links in the great chain of events by which we have reached our present position, will make a note of this occasion. They will think of it and speak of it with a sense of manly pride and complacency." Then, despite his praise for the impulse that brought everyone together for the monument's unveiling, he launched a careful critique of Lincoln, calling him, quote, "the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men." We can sense in Douglass's oration a bold claim about the legacy of Lincoln that was borne out by the visual aesthetics of the memorial itself. Despite its potential to celebrate Black achievement and interracial equality, the statue group's representation of a white man lording over a Black one, quote, effectively closed the era of emancipation with the old image of a Black man still mired in the ethos of slavery, as Kirk Savage has influentially argued. Douglass's ambivalence toward the memorial was further underscored when, in the midst of 2020's anti-racist protests, historian Scott Savage discovered a letter by Douglass, originally published in the National Republican. The letter began by stating that sculptor Thomas Ball's memorial, quote, does not tell the whole truth, and perhaps no one monument could be made to tell the whole truth of any subject which it might be designed to illustrate. After pointing out that securing Black citizenship was the province of both Presidents Lincoln and Grant, despite what the monument would seem to depict, Douglass then critiqued the Emancipation Memorial's depiction of the Black man and called for another statue for Lincoln Park. Quote, "What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro not couchant on his knees like a four-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man," Douglass wrote. Douglass's letter uses the genre of the monument to imagine a Black future, not of submission and subservience, but of equality. And indeed, while monuments were instrumental in reflecting and furthering post-war racist ideologies, as Savage and others have indelibly shown, they could also be employed to conceive of different Black futures. Within the space of Lincoln Park, Douglas calls for another monument, another node in the ongoing monumental conversation afforded by the space, which was the site of a large Civil War hospital and which lies 1 mile due east of the US Capitol. Later in the letter, Douglas says that he wants to see this imagined monument within his own lifetime, a demand that links the aging figure with a new generation of activists who will transform African American statuary. Douglas's reference is reminiscent of recent scholarly attempts to understand 19th century Black cultural production within a genealogical framework that emphasizes kinship ties over biological relation. This critical approach, which was the organizing feature of a 2020 special issue of American Literary History on genealogies of Black modernities, edited by Cornell's Derek R. Spires, promises to, quote, resist normalized teleologies of descent and extend its branches into complex webs that emerge within Black futures and help to produce them. Bridget Fielder has argued that these web-like relations extend through and across genres and temporalities, and that, quote, genealogies are not necessarily linear, but sometimes circuitous. Douglas's rediscovered letter instigates one of these moments of genealogical revision. It also demonstrates that one of the most important post-war genres for reaching both back into the past and forward into the future was the monument, an important genre not only for shoring up white histories, but also Black ones. My talk today uses Elmira as a case study in the fraught and overlapping geographies that both inform and come to embody post-war monumentalizing. I take Elmira as one example of a conversation surrounding Black histories and Black memory taking place across the United States after the Civil War. These conversations reached backward to illuminate Black histories and forward to anticipate Black futures. We have already seen how DC's Emancipation Memorial was another site of Black monumentalizing in the post-war era. So too was Boston's Robert Gould Shaw and Massachusetts 54th Regiment Memorial, unveiled to the public in 1897. And we could also add to this list of Black monumentalizing moments and spaces vernacular memorial practices like the 1865 procession of Black mourners in Charleston that David Blight has identified as the prototype for Memorial Day. It is true that, as John Levy Barnard has shown, postbellum African-American cultural production often emphasized the ruin as a monumental form that allowed for structural critique of US empire. But spaces like Elmira demonstrate how Black citizens not only thought of the monument as an instrument of white supremacy or a genre of critique, but also as a medium for imagining Black futures. In this way, we might think of the monument both as a genre for thinking through the intersections of memory and history, and as a physical object, as an understudied framework for witnessing the theorization of Black citizenship. And here I evoke, again, Derek R. Spires' trenchant study of print culture as a potent space where citizenship was theorized and practiced. This talk will explore how the literal space of Elmira and efforts across time to preserve and shape memory there, here, events multiple articulations of how African Americans constructed their own versions of history, alongside and sometimes in contradistinction to what white Americans envisioned. So usually when I launch into this story, I have to do some geographical situating. But I'm thrilled to be able to skip over this segment where I describe Elmira's importance as a transportation hub and as a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment in the 19th century, et cetera, and so on, for this particular audience. Instead, I'll turn directly to the two men at the heart of Elmira's monumental story. And again, they are figures who are very, very familiar to you all. They are John Jones and Mark Twain. I'll turn to two burial grounds, again, familiar spaces, one a town cemetery, the other a national cemetery, located next to each other. And two private houses, Jones's home opposite the cemeteries and Quarry Farm on a hillside overlooking the city. These are, I know, familiar landscapes for many of you. Maybe you drive past them on the way to work. Maybe a loved one is buried in Woodlawn. When they're present in your hometown, these places can maybe become everyday, but as an outsider, I marvel at Elmira's palimpsestic past, And I'll also add that I found my own familiar and disconcerting connection with the city, which I'll return to in the conclusion of this talk. Elmira's story is important to me because of that palimpsestic quality. It features so many historical moments: the pre-war period when the city was a major stop on the Underground Railroad, the city's service as a site of a Civil War prisoner of war camp, the post-war years when the National Cemetery developed, the obliteration and preservation of historical sites in the 20th and 21st centuries. These histories loop and overlap, they appear and recede from view, and they also, as we all know, coincide with the literary career of Mark Twain, which makes me interested in how the memories enshrined in Elmira's landscape emerge as themes in Twain's fiction. Today I'll focus particularly on the short story, A True Story, repeated word for word as I heard it, as a text where Twain arbitrates the intersections of Civil War memory and race. I relate Twain's thinly fictionalized account of his cook Marianne Cord's reunion with her son with another tale of reunion told in Elmira lore, the one that took place between African-American cemetery caretaker John W. Jones and the son of the family that once enslaved him. There are other strands of relation in my talk today. I will speak briefly about my own relation, whose story connects with Jones's and through geography, Twain's. And I'll end with a glimpse of a final moment of relation between Jones, Twain, and the man whose words I used to begin this paper, Frederick Douglass. Ultimately, in tracing these paths of relation and genealogies of monumentalizing made visible in Elmira from the 19th century through the contemporary moment, I seek to form a case study in how certain dynamic monumental landscapes manifest post-war intersections of race and memory that continue to be arbitrated today. So the purpose of a monument is to project permanence, right? It's there, it exists, it's stone. Yet the example of the Emancipation Memorial and Douglass's desire to see the space transform over time demonstrates the essential dynamism and shifting nature of monumental landscapes. This transformative function is borne out in the story of Elmira. When I describe Elmira to outsiders, I love to begin by mentioning the billboard of famous Elmirans that you see when you enter the city. You guys know it, right? There's Mark Twain, there's Brian Williams, there's Tommy Hilfiger, of course, the astronaut Eileen Collins, the football hero Ernie Davis, TV producer Hal Roach. Often I'll conduct a sort of quiz. How many of these figures can you name by sight? And one of the figures who remains unidentifiable is John W. Jones. You all are lucky enough to live in a city that celebrates Jones and his accomplishments, particularly through the work of the John W. Jones Museum and the Chemung County Historical Society. But outside of Elmira, his remarkable life story is virtually unknown. That story is brought into focus in the physical landscape of Woodlawn Cemetery, where Twain's much-visited grave lies near Jones's, and both sit adjacent to the National Cemetery, which of course Jones worked to create. So when I think of how we might put John W. Jones and Mark Twain in relation, first I think of geography, particularly their proximity and depth. I also think of familial relation. Jones worked closely with Twain's future father-in-law, of course, Jervis Langdon, when funneling self-emancipated people through the city on the Underground Railroad, and family letters indicate that Jones and Twain met at least once later in their lives, when Twain interviewed Jones for a potential biography. As Twain's sister-in-law Susan Crane described the meeting that took place around 1888, Twain, quote, took no notes and was unwilling to make any use of Jones's story, because he said it should only be told in Mr. Jones's language. In life and in death, Twain and Jones were connected through Elmira's history, its memorial landscape, and a complicated relation to storytelling and the Black postbellum experience. So Elmira, to me, is a Civil War memorial site that unsettles our popular understanding of the war and how it was conducted. Far from any battlefield, the city nonetheless witnessed some of the worst horrors of the war. 1 in 4 of those who were imprisoned at Elmira died there. Elmira's celebrated vacationer Mark Twain also bears a complicated relation to the conflict. He participated only tangentially. He famously penned the private history of a campaign that failed to detail just how little he did in the war. He wrote, "You have heard from a great many people who did something in the war. Is it not fair and right that you listen a little moment to one who started out to do something in it, but didn't?" He goes on to write that people who entered the war and then left it, quote, ought at least to be able to state why they didn't do anything, and also to explain the process by which they didn't do anything. While Twain was enlisted for 2 weeks in the Confederate cause, though he never officially joined the Army, he tremendously embellished his experience in both the private history and other speeches, leaving the exact nature of his participation in the war and his loyalties up to debate. Twain's relation to issues of race are similarly complicated, to put it extremely mildly. As you all know, Twain wrote Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Elmira on the grounds of Quarry Farm, where daily he heard the voices and stories of Marianne Cord, a formerly enslaved woman who worked as a cook for the Crane family, and John T. Lewis, a local farmer and devout Dunkard who was born free in Maryland. The conversations and connections forged between Twain, Cord, and Lewis have been well documented by scholars and biographers, but the ties that link Twain up at Quarry Farm and the Civil War memorial landscapes down here in Elmira, and consequently to Jones, remain more obscure. So in my remaining time, I'll ask, what happens when we read Mark Twain down here in Elmira in relation to the National Cemetery beside which he's buried? And what happens when we read John W. Jones up at Quarry Farm in relation to the famous author with whom he now shares a billboard? To begin with the first question and read Twain alongside Elmira's monumental landscape, we first need to acknowledge that the geographical boundaries generated by the war's presence in Elmira are both extant and elusive. The prisoner of war camp is of course long gone, though the Friends of the Elmira Prison Camp have worked to improve an extant building and erect replicas. There was never a battlefield to be preserved. Instead, what remains are monuments. The National Cemetery, the houses of Jones and Twain, the memorials to both men in the city. Each are shrines to memory itself. And I think we can read John W. Jones's actions during the Civil War, his decision to bury with respect the bodies of some 3,000 Confederates, as a monumental act, one that understood the power of memory and sought to tell a new story of Black citizenship through it. So the tale of how Jones became the caretaker of memory in Elmira begins, and forgive me for rehearsing what many of you may find a familiar story, but I think it's always useful to reiterate just how remarkable Jones's actions were and are. That story begins when Elmira Prison was created in July 1864. It was carved from land leased to the state of New York by William Foster that stretched from the Chemung River to the road on which the Fosters lived that had once housed Union Army barracks. When it was built, Elmira Prison had no cemetery. Within a month, however, it became apparent that a cemetery would be required, and a half acre of ground was rented from Woodlawn Cemetery to bury the Confederate dead. In addition, the commissary authorized paying a person $40 a month to bury those soldiers. The task of burial went to Jones, who was a sexton at Woodlawn Cemetery, and not just burial, the transportation of the bodies from the prison to the cemetery, the digging of trenches, the painting of wooden headboards to mark the dead, the recording of deaths. In nearly every account of Jones's work as keeper of the dead at Elmira, the care of his record keeping is highlighted. For instance, the earliest history of the prison by Clay Holmes states, quote, "The entire record as kept by Sexton Jones is perfect, with the exception of 7 listed as unknown. This is supposed to be because the prisoners often gave fictitious names on the prison roll, and while most revealed their true names before death, some died so suddenly that they did not or could not tell their real names." According to the narratives told about Elmira and a memorial placard located in the National Cemetery, this care is the reason why so many Southern families decided to leave their sons' bodies in a distant place far to the north. The unnaturalness of these Southern bodies buried in northern climes was clearly one of the memorial problems generated by the Civil War. The nation had determined how to deal with the volume of dead bodies resulting from the war through the newly developed memorial genre of the National Cemetery, which emphasized mass sacrifice over individual grief. But how do you incorporate rebels, traitors into a national cemetery? And how do you mourn them? A poem like Thomas Bailey Aldrich's Springtime in New England worries that northern bodies buried in the South will go unmourned. And so too does the memorial language surrounding Elmira fear that these displaced Confederates have been abandoned in an unfamiliar locale. Until, that is, the story of John W. Jones allows for a geographical healing founded in the forgiveness of an ex-enslaved person. Indeed, the deep irony of a self-emancipated man caring for those who would have kept him enslaved resonates in all the language that enshrines Jones. A memorial erected to him in 1997 at his grave in Woodlawn Cemetery reads, "He risked his life to escape bondage, then dedicated his life to bury those who might enslave him." One oft-told story emerging from histories of the prison states that one day, while preparing bodies, Jones recognized a name on the casket, John R. Rollins, the son of his former overseer in Virginia, and a friend of Jones's before his escape. According to lore, Jones wrote to the Rollins family to learn their son's fate. When he heard back that their son had enlisted and was missing, Jones wrote to the mother that, quote, her boy was found and had been tenderly laid to rest in grateful remembrance of her loving kindness to him when he was a slave. Here, Jones's mercy takes on a Christ-like quality. If he can forgive the man who once controlled him as property and provide a beautiful and sacred burial for that man, then why can't the wounds of war be healed? This compassionate version of Jones also emerges in a story from Holmes's History of Elmira Prison, about Jones returning to the plantation in Virginia where he was born 3 years after the Civil War. According to Holmes, all his relatives and slave friends were dead or gone away. None knew where, and he only found one representative of the Elsie family, by whom he was greeted cordially and received in his home as a guest. Holmes gives no source for this story, and the confusing pronoun in his home, is he Jones or the Elsie family representative, gestures toward the reconciliatory tone of this tale and of the monument erected to Jones. The home, of course, was never Jones's, yet Jones's forgiveness and the lack of any other witnesses of the atrocities of slavery on the plantation allows for the former site of horror to become a peaceful domestic setting again. Notably, the mobility that Jones demonstrates in the anecdote replicates the mobility he fostered as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but reverses the trek toward freedom in the North in order to heal the old wounds of slavery. From the histories of Elmira Prison, two versions of Jones emerge, one of Jones, the keeper of memory, the other of Jones, the capitalist. A number of stories about Jones from late in his life remark on his wealth, including an obituary in the Elmira Daily Gazette and Free Press that features the headline, "Born a slave, died rich." In addition, Holmes records that the money he received from the US government to bury bodies, quote, was the basis of the comfortable fortune he amassed in the years after the war. He was rated as the wealthiest colored man in this part of the state. This version of Jones, as capitalist, taking advantage of an opportunity to profit from the war, aligns him more with Horatio Alger-type post-war heroes than angels of mourning, and provides more nuance to Jones's act of memorialization. To probe the motivations behind the stories told about Jones, which indeed provide some of the most persistent stories told about Elmira's prison, is not to question his motivations, which were likely altruistic and self-serving at the same time as so many of our impulses are. Rather, it's to ask how the figure of the ex-enslaved person in postbellum America became a safe story of remembrance, a remembrance that then begot a forgetting of atrocity. So John W. Jones's remarkable story of self-emancipation and resistance and success is not the only expression of the intersections of Black history and memory that we can situate in Elmira following the Civil War. In 1874, Mark Twain published a true story repeated word for word as I heard it, taking pains to emphasize the story's truth not only in its title, with its gesture toward journalistic veracity, but also in an accompanying letter to the editor of the Atlantic Monthly, William Dean Howells, where Twain said, "I have not altered the old colored woman's story except to begin it at the beginning instead of the middle, as she did, and traveled both ways." The old colored woman who becomes Aunt Rachel in the story is Mary Ann Cord, the previously mentioned cook at Quarry Farm. As Kathleen Diffley has noted, Cord was, quote, about 76, looked 60, and appeared carefree, but she still remembered the sale of her husband and children in 1852, and her rediscovery of Henry, her son, during the Civil War, a story her family has kept alive to this day. A true story was Twain's first published in Howells's venerable magazine of Northern Taste and Letters. At its heart, this is the story of an ex-enslaved woman's reunion with her son, and it contains many parallels with the later conjure tales of Charles W. Chestnut. In it, a Black woman's story of slavery times before the war, is told through a white interlocutor, Mr. C, who was clearly meant to invoke the author himself, though not the famous Mark Twain, but his more obscure original self, Samuel Clemens. Stripping away the authorial persona forces the tale's readers to contemplate artifice and identity. Indeed, a true story stages the question of what truth means when it's told secondhand, with a white author attempting to replicate African American speech and to tell an African American tale of loss and reunion. A True Story has been called Twain's best story about the Civil War and praised for its manipulation of the tropes of the local color genre. Diffley, for example, notes that despite the many similarities between Twain's story and the one passed down through Cord's family, the author does make a few key alterations. Auntie Cord becomes Rachel, a name with obvious biblical resonances that underscore Auntie Cord's role as a mother weeping for her lost children. Twain also rearranges the order of events from Cord's family tale and, most importantly for my reading, provides a frame narrative that situates the moment of storytelling on the porch of a farmhouse on the summit of a hill, a setting clearly meant to represent Quarry Farm in Elmira. The narrative voice immediately establishes racial hierarchy, but by describing how, quote, Aunt Rachel was sitting respectfully below our level on the steps, for she was our servant and colored. After describing Aunt Rachel's love of laughter, Mr. C makes an assumption about her experience. Quote, Aunt Rachel, how is it you've lived 60 years and never had any trouble? When Aunt Rachel asks if Mr. C is earnest in his question, he responds haltingly, why, I thought, that is, I meant, well, you can't have had any trouble. At this, Rachel launches into her history as an enslaved person, being sold and separated from her husband and 7 children. Years later, when Rachel's master abandons her in occupied New Bern, North Carolina, she begins cooking for Union soldiers, including a black regiment. One of these soldiers recognizes Rachel through a phrase she commonly uses, get along with you, rubbish, and comes to see her while she is removing biscuits from the oven, his scars revealing him to be her youngest son, Henry. The story ends with Aunt Rachel proclaiming, with sarcasm, in answer to her employer's initial lack of empathy, oh no, Mr. C, I hain't had no trouble and no joy. Aunt Rachel's story of separation and reunion, told after the war that ended slavery and rendered by a white author in dialect, uses many of the set pieces of slave narratives, families torn apart, the horrors of the auction block, the uncaring master, the unexpected reunion, the coming of war. These plots accumulate to stage a scene in which subjectivity is explored and shown to be deeper and more complex than one individual could possibly imagine. Though the story is framed by a narrative voice that is clearly Clemens's, Aunt Rachel gets the last word, as well as the upper hand over her employer when she is shown to have had as much trouble and joy as could be imagined. Diffley productively reads the story alongside Louisa May Alcott's harrowing 1863 tale, The Brothers, in which the ruinous separation of black families inspired and justified murderous intentions. By the 1870s, these families were, quote, almost gratuitously restored as magazines tempered their formerly firebrand abolitionist ethics within the political climate of reconciliation and failed Reconstruction. Reading Twain's story alongside other true stories of race and reunion, to borrow a phrase from David Blight, changes how we understand the tales often circulated in Elmira of Jones bearing the white son of his former overseer and returning to the plantation where he was enslaved after the war's conclusion. Taken together, they illuminate how deeply the processes of post-war reconciliation were dependent on narratives of black forgiveness told within a white envelope, recalling John Zikora's indelible description of antebellum slave narratives. Yet it's also true that these Elmira tales contain traces of other stories we might tell. A story of Marianne Cord instructing her white employer on the true depths of despair wrought by slavery. A story of John W. Jones becoming comparatively rich by burying the Southern dead with respect. Another story of Jones seeking out the family that he had been forced to abandon after self-emancipation, only to find that all his relatives and slave friends were dead or gone away. In these traces, we see an insistence on understanding and sharing past traumas and triumphs, both troubles and joys. So in a letter to Wilbur Seibert, Susan Crane theorized John W. Jones's legacy in Elmira. She wrote, When, after the war, Southern friends came to claim their dead, this, quote, fugitive slave who had made a place for himself and become a respected citizen was the man who always gave the required information. The connection Crane draws between making a place and becoming a respected citizen is illustrative of what I've been calling the process of Black monumentalizing. The act of placemaking, of ascribing narratives to sites like national cemeteries or farmhouse porches, is also an act of citizenship that paves the way for particular futures. As the keeper not only of the monuments found within the National Cemetery, but also of the, quote, required information surrounding the Southern dead, Jones secured a place for himself and his descendants in Elmira. Despite Crane's nuanced understanding of Jones's monumental acts, we still might wish to know what Jones had to say for himself about his motivations. Was he concerned with profits or with the sacred burial of bodies, even the bodies of men who would have sent him back to slavery? Why did he do it, right? We don't have that many of Jones's own words, although you can see on this slide an example of a letter that Jones also wrote to Wilbur Seibert. It's not clear to me, maybe Matt knows, if he would have typed it himself or if Susan Crane would have typed it. It's in the same type as the ones from Susan Crane. Don't know. It's an interesting question. But it was really cool to see this sort of among Susan Crane's reminiscences of abolition in Elmira. And Matt also brought my attention to another newspaper article that has Jones's words in it, where we get him kind of unfiltered. So that's for the next lecture. But for today, I just want to look at this particular example, which is from William Still's 1872 History of the Underground Railroad. In 1860, Jones had written a letter to Still to confirm that he had helped 6 slaves who made a dangerous escape from Maryland on the Delaware Bay. Still includes the letter in its entirety in his account of the escape. The letter reads, Elmira, June 6, 1860. Friend William Still, all 6 came safe to this place. The 2 men came last night about 12 o'clock. The man and woman stopped at the depot and went east on the next train about 18 miles and did not get back till tonight, so that the 2 men went this morning and the 4 went this evening. O old master, don't cry for me, for I am going to Canada where colored men are free. P.S. What is the news in the city? Will you tell me how many you have over to Canada? I would like to know. They all send their love to you. I have nothing new to tell you. You're all in good health. I see there is a law passed in Maryland not to set any slaves free. They had better get the consent of the Underground Railroad before they pass such a thing. Good night from your friend, John W. Jones. This remarkable missive forces us to confront a Jones who does not disappear into the margins of readability and remembrance, but who stares directly at us, forcing us to acknowledge his agency. The militant stance of the letter, in which the authority of the Underground Railroad conductor is placed above the law of the land, chafes against the record of Jones as a beneficent and forgiving mourner to reveal competing notions of the role of memory in the wake of the Civil War. That is, the written histories of Elmira and the words of John W. Jones demonstrate the deep schism at the heart of post-war memory. The schism pits memory that is constructive to reconstruction against memory that preserves the true atrocities of prisons and slavery and war. Understanding Jones's motivations involves not only recasting the words he left behind, but also the site of memory he helped to create. If we think of the memorial landscape as another form of cultural production through which Black Americans could forge alternative forms of relation, then we might read his actions at Elmira as a form of both Black resistance and Black success. Reading Jones's memorial work alongside Caretha Mitchell's harrowing insights into how successful Black men and women were targeted for lynching by whites gives an altogether different cast to his actions. Jones participated in crafting a memorial space that not only satisfied white supremacists by honoring their memory, but also signaled the potential for Black success in the post-war United States. So I'd like to close my remarks today with 2 more vignettes on relation. The first is a personal one. After visiting Elmira for the first time and learning the story of John W. Jones, I discovered that his work to preserve memory was not as remote as I'd originally imagined. An idle search on Ancestry.com revealed that my own paternal great-great-great-grandfather was among the Confederate soldiers buried with care by Jones in Woodlawn Cemetery. I tried to do justice to this point of relation in an episode of the C19 podcast last year. So I'll direct you there if you want to hear some more thoughts on this. But for today's purposes, I'll say that one way I sort of consider what Jones did for those men from North Carolina and Georgia and Missouri who would have seen him still enslaved was this. He provided a home in an unfamiliar place. I'm tempted to make some connection between those rebels marooned in death in Elmira with the half-hearted Confederate Mark Twain, marooned on East Hill, making a home there. But perhaps the tie is tenuous. I'm not aware of any instances of Twain commenting on those Confederate graves. If you are, please tell me. But he must have seen them, right? He must have known of them. From Thomas Beecher, who ministered to the prisoners, from the Langdons, so involved in abolition, who must have witnessed the bodies being taken from the Riverside camp to the burial ground, and of course from Jones himself. And he would have seen them each sad time he had to bury or imagine the burial of one of his or his wife's family members in Woodlawn. The second vignette of relation, and the place where I'd like to conclude this talk, attempts to bring together in time and space many of the figures that we've looked at today. And Matt Siebold has already previewed this for me beautifully, which is this moment that we're about to see the anniversary of, this talk in honor of Emancipation that Frederick Douglass gave in Elmira next week, basically, is the anniversary. And so I'm so grateful to Matt for all the archival work that he's doing to bring this story to light. But so what happened was, in 1880, 4 years after his speech at the Emancipation Memorial in DC, Frederick Douglass, who was called by the local newspaper the foremost colored man in the world, came to Elmira to participate in a celebration of West India emancipation and the Emancipation Proclamation. And this was a celebration entirely headed by Elmira's Black citizens. The grand and comprehensive scale of the day was noted in the Elmira Daily Advertiser as it described the plans for a parade, music, prayers, recitations, and, of course, the oration by Douglass, followed by a, quote, sumptuous dinner and a military ball. On the reception committee sat John T. Lewis, Twain's close friend, while the president of the day, which I take as a sort of honorary role similar to a master of ceremonies, was none other than John W. Jones. Jones welcomed Douglass to Elmira with a few short and happy remarks, according to the newspaper, and Douglass responded with the following words addressed to Elmira's leading Black citizen, quote, Mr. President, I thank you sincerely for this cordial greeting. I hear in your speech something like a welcome home after a long absence. More years of my life and labors have been spent in this than in any other state of the Union. Anywhere within 100 miles of the goodly city of Rochester, I feel myself at home and among friends. Douglass's sense of feeling at home in Elmira recalls the variety of homes I've tried to place in conversation during this talk. Quarry Farm on East Hill, the Jones home now opposite the cemetery, the Elsie plantation in Virginia, the broken and then repaired home of Marianne Cord. This, quote, grand day of enjoyment and commemoration, as the Daily Advertiser put it, which was Tuesday, August 3rd, 1880, is the final act of Black monumentalizing I'd like to note today. This day of joy and sorrow reconsecrated and recast traces of historical memory. Memories of the Civil War, which were represented by the, quote, colored veterans who marched in the procession, by the presence of Jones in the chief carriage alongside Douglass, by the recitation of the Emancipation Proclamation. And these memories were transformed into an active display of citizenship. Near the end of the procession, this is my favorite detail from the newspaper reports, 4 carriages held 38 young women, quote, in attire suggestive of the then 38 states of the Union. So somehow each of these women, I think, was representing a different state, and I tried to imagine how in the world, what that would have looked like exactly. Watching the display was a crowd of white folks, and among them, it seems likely, stay tuned next week, was Mark Twain. Douglas was a close friend of the Langdons, who reportedly had helped him during his escape from slavery in 1838 and had housed and supported him many times since. It's with this scene that I'd like to close, with Douglas on the podium in Hoffman's Grove Park, which is of course within a mile of both the site of the POW camp and Woodlawn National Cemetery. Douglas was repurposing the past to galvanize the, quote, new generation that listened to him there. I'd like to end with John W. Jones and John T. Lewis nearby, two Southern men, one born free, one born enslaved, who both found versions of freedom in Elmira, with Twain, perhaps, milling in the crowd, Huck percolating in his brain. In this moment, in this place, and only in Elmira, was such a confluence of memory and future building possible. Thank you.